From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Many of the COVID deaths could have been avoided if there were a government who did their job. This country is disorganized and falling apart because it has no government.
As Brazil's COVID death toll soars, former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva attacks Jair Bolsonaro a day after a judge cleared Lula to run again for president by annulling questionable corruption charges against him. We'll go to Brazil to speak with one of Lula's lawyers. Plus, we look at the global fight over COVID vaccine patents. The United States and other wealthy nations are backing Big Pharma, while the World Health Organization said patent rights should be waived.
This is unprecedented times, and we believe, and WHO believes, that this is a time to trigger that provision and waive patent rights.
Then the Biden administration struggling to find shelter space for a record 3,500 migrant children recently detained at the U.S.-Mexico border.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities. It is not a replication, certainly not. That is never our intention of replicating the immigration policies of the past administration.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives have approved a final version of the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called the bill a historic turning point that will restore Americans' faith in government.
Help is on the way. You will receive $1,400 checks by the end of March. Help is on the way. Vaccines will be available far more quickly to far more people in a shorter time. Help is on the way. Our schools will open safely and more quickly than we thought. Help is on the way. Half of America's children who are in poverty will not be in poverty because of this bill. Help is on the way.
The legislation passed both the U.S. House and Senate without the support of a single Republican. It's overwhelmingly supported by the U.S. public, both Democrat and Republican alike. After its passage, Mississippi Republican Senator Roger Wicker tweeted approvingly, quote, "This funding will ensure small businesses can survive the pandemic by helping to adapt their operations and keep their employees on the payroll," unquote. Again, Senator Wicker voted against the bill. President Biden will sign the legislation at the White House on Friday. He and Vice President Kamala Harris are planning a nationwide tour to promote the legislation beginning next week. This evening, Biden will deliver a primetime address to the nation, marking 1 year since the World Health Organization declared a COVID-19 pandemic. During the past year, more than 118 million people have become infected, with over 2.6 million deaths from COVID-19 worldwide. Central Europe's currently the worst affected part of the world. The Czech Republic, which has one of the highest per capita death rates from COVID-19, has begun sending patients abroad after intensive care units fill to capacity. Some Czech health officials believe as much as 45% of the population's become infected over the past year. Meanwhile, a peer-reviewed study in the British Medical Journal found a coronavirus variant first detected in the UK is likely more deadly than earlier variants of the virus, causing up to twice as many deaths. Another recent study in the journal Science finds it's significantly more transmissible. The variant accounts for an estimated 1 in 5 new coronavirus infections in the United States this week. The U.S. reported nearly 59,000 new coronavirus infections and over 1,500 deaths Wednesday. President Biden said the U.S. plans to order another 100 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine. White House medical advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci said if vaccinations continue at their current pace, the U.S. could reach herd immunity by early fall. In Texas, Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton's threatening to sue the city city of Austin if it enforces a citywide mask mandate. On Wednesday, Texas officially lifted all compulsory public health measures, including limits on public gatherings and mask requirements, though individual businesses can still require customers to wear masks. Amnesty International has called the deadly crackdown on Burmese anti-coup protests a killing spree and accused the military of extrajudicial executions. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council has condemned the violent response to protests over the last 6 weeks in Burma, but stopped short of condemning the actual February 1st coup or threatening sanctions. A Burmese rights group says at least 60 people have been killed and over 2,000 detained since the start of the protests. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is urging an end to the war in Syria as the world marks 10 years since the start of the deadly conflict, which Guterres called a living nightmare. Hundreds of thousands have been killed, millions displaced, and the UN warns some 60% of Syrians are at risk of hunger this year. This is the Secretary-General.
It is impossible to fully fathom the extent of the devastation in Syria, but its people have endured some of the greatest crimes the world has witnessed this century. And the scale of the atrocities shocks the consciences. Their perpetrators must be held to account if there is to be sustainable peace in Syria.
Syria has also been faced with a worsening economic crisis due to the pandemic over the past year, exacerbated by sweeping U.S. sanctions. Earlier this week, President Bashar al-Assad and his wife tested positive for the coronavirus. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has made his first public appearance since a judge annulled all convictions against him Monday, clearing his path to challenge far-right President Jair Bolsonaro for the presidency in 2022. In a major speech Wednesday, Lula blasted Bolsonaro's handling of the COVID-19 crisis.
Many of the COVID deaths could have been avoided if there were a government who did their job. This country is disorganized and falling apart because it has no government. I will repeat, this country has no government.
More than 270,000 Brazilians have died of COVID-19 over the last year, the second highest figure in the world behind the United States. After headlines, we'll go to Brazil to speak with one of former President Lula's lead attorneys. Mexico is poised to become the world's largest marijuana market after lawmakers approved a landmark bill Wednesday legalizing recreational use of cannabis. The legislation, which is backed by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is still being finalized but could bring major shifts to a country that's been plagued by drug-related violence. Some critics have warned a legal market for marijuana would favor big companies, while low possession limits would still penalize consumers. Activists also say the new law should address the harm caused by years of militarized anti-drug policies. The Biden administration may use a vacant NASA research center in the San Francisco Bay Area to temporarily house unaccompanied migrant children. It's one of several proposals under consideration as the administration faces a growing crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border, where it's holding some 3,500 unaccompanied children in detention cells for longer than legally allowed. The top White House advisor on U.S.-Mexico border policy, Roberta Jacobson, said Wednesday the Biden administration's reinstating the Central American Minors Program, which allows some children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to reunite with a parent or parents living in the U.S. But Jacobson declared repeatedly in both English and Spanish that the border is not open.
I want to be clear, neither this announcement nor any of the other measures suggests that anyone, especially children and families with young children, should make the dangerous trip to try and enter the U.S. in an irregular fashion. The border is not open.
We'll have the latest on the crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border later in the broadcast with Aura Bogada, the senior investigative reporter at Reveal. The Senate's confirmed Marcia Fudge as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Michael Regan to head the Environmental Protection Agency, and Merrick Garland as Attorney General. Regan will be the first black man to lead the EPA, while Fudge is the first black woman to oversee HUD since the Jimmy Carter administration more than 40 years ago. In Iowa, Des Moines Register reporter Andrea Sahuri was acquitted Wednesday following her arrest last year while covering a Black Lives Matter protest. She was pepper sprayed and put in zip ties despite telling police officers she was a reporter. Freedom of the Press Foundation welcomed the acquittal but said it, quote, doesn't fully lift the shadow this prosecution has cast over one of our country's most core values, unquote. Here in New York, human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger is waiting to hear if he will be freed after nearly 600 days of house arrest after an appeals court last week threw out a key contempt finding against him. Donziger won a historic settlement for $9.5 billion against Chevron in Ecuador for dumping oil and toxic waste in the Amazon, but he's been facing contempt charges from a private law firm which has ties to Chevron and the oil industry. Chevron has yet to pay compensation or clean up after the catastrophic damage it created. Last month, Amnesty USA and a dozen other groups sent a letter to Merrick Garland asking him to review Donziger's case. And today marks 10 years since Japan's triple disaster, when a massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake triggered a tsunami and nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima power plant. Nearly 20,000 people were killed. Japan marked the day with a moment of silence, prayers, and anti-nuclear protests. Ahead of today's remembrance, anti-nuclear protesters rallied in front of Japan's parliament.
No matter how nuclear plants are stable or cheap, I think they're inappropriate as a means of power generation because they ravage the foundations of local people's living. I came here to voice my opposition.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined remotely by my co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has been cleared to run for president again after a judge annulled all convictions against him. 3 years ago, Lula had been considered a favorite in the lead-up to the 2018 presidential election until he was put in jail for 18 months and forced out of the race. The jailing of Lula helped pave the way for the election of the far-right former military officer Jair Bolsonaro. Lula is a former union leader who served as president of Brazil from 2003 to 2010. During that time, he helped lift tens of millions of Brazilians out of poverty. President Barack Obama once called him the most popular politician on earth. On Wednesday, Lula blasted Bolsonaro's handling of the COVID crisis.
Many of the COVID deaths could have been avoided if there were a government who did their job. This country is disorganized and falling apart because it has no government. There was a president who invented chloroquine, a president who said that those who were scared of COVID are sissies, that COVID was just a little flu, that COVID was something for cowards, that he was a former athlete and it would not affect him. That is not the role of a president of the republic in a civilized country.
More than 270,000 Brazilians have died over the past year from COVID, the second highest figure in the world behind the United States. On Wednesday, Brazil reported nearly 2,300 new deaths, its highest daily death toll since the start of the pandemic. Lula also criticized Bolsonaro's skepticism over COVID vaccines and Brazil's delays in obtaining them.
The question of the vaccine, it is not a question if you have money or if you don't. It is a question of life or death. It is a question of knowing what is the role of the President of the Republic to take care of, because a president is not elected to spread fake news.
In his speech, Lula also compared Bolsonaro to Donald Trump.
This country is disorganized and falling apart because it has no government. I will repeat, this country has no government. And with fake news, the world elected former President Donald Trump. And with fake news, the world elected Bolsonaro.
We go now to Brazil, where we're joined by Valesca Martins, one of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's lead attorneys, co-author of Lawfare, Waging War Through Law. She's the founder of the Lawfare Institute. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Thanks so much for joining us, Valesca. Can you talk about the significance of the judge's annulment of the charges against Lula, for which he already served time in prison, and what this means for the future and this major address that Lula gave yesterday?
Thank you, Amy, for inviting me to come over here today and briefly describe what is being now called as the biggest judicial scandal on earth. Lula was wrongfully charged, wrongfully prosecuted, illegally prosecuted by the car wash operation, which now we know that acted in collusion with the prosecutors and the presiding judge of the case. I think it means, first of all, that the rule of law in Brazil came out as a winner, that democracy came out winning, because Lula, as you already mentioned, in 2018 should have run for president. He was illegally removed from the race. He was in jail for 580 days. During that period, he lost his brother. He was not allowed to even actually go to his brother's funeral. He lost his grandchild who died of a disease at an early age. He could not go freely to his funeral as well. He lost his political rights. He lost all of his rights, not only financially speaking. The presumption of his presumption of innocence was highly violated, which is a gross violation of human rights. So after 5 years, which comes in a delay, he was declared not innocent because actually the procedures will go on, but all of the procedures since the charges, not only the convictions, but all procedures against President Lula within the car wash operation have been annulled. This means that he can run for president. He has all of his political rights standing. He is a citizen that should be presumed innocent before everybody's eyes.
Well, Valeska, could you explain, though, as you mentioned, the annulment was a procedural decision, not a substantive one. So Lula could still be tried and will be tried in federal court. Do you know when this retrial will occur and what the implications of it could be? Actually,
Amy, because we were fighting in a court which had a clear bias nature, in a clear unfair trial, which did not take in regard any of the numerous evidences, overwhelming evidences of his innocence. We believe that if a new judge comes in charge to preside over any case, retry this case, it is imperative that he does not even respond to any charges arising from the car wash operation. We have the trial and the pre-trial situation regarding these cases, and they are all no. They are all no. We have been saying that the full application of the law has to come in force in this case. And Lula is not above the law, but nobody is above the law. And in a major complex case, we have come across overwhelming evidence of collusion between the prosecutors and the presiding judge of the case, former Judge Moro, which have described in unheard messages which have been filed now before the Supreme Court that they had a Lula plan, which meant create enough charges to overwhelm the defense, to occupy the defense's time and resources in order for them to convict him and remove him from his political life.
Well, let me go to Lula in his own words. In 2018, we spoke with Brazil's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, popularly known as Lula, when he was running for president. At the time, he was facing a possible prison term on what obviously many believe to be trumped-up corruption charges tied to the sprawling probe known as Operation Car Wash. This is what he said.
Eu não fui denunciado por corrupção.
I was not accused of corruption. I was accused because of a lie.
Uma mentira do inquérito policial.
In a police investigation.
Do Ministério Público.
A lie in an indictment by the Office of the Attorney General and in the judgment of Judge Moro.
Porque só tem uma prova em todo esse processo que é a prova da minha inocência.
Only one evidence of my innocence in this entire trial,
que meus advogados de defesa fizeram de forma magistral,
which my defense counsel explained in a magisterial manner.
So that was about a month before he was imprisoned. Now in this major address that looked like really a campaign rally at his union, the Metal Workers Union, where he had also gone right before he went to jail, he had banners proclaiming health, jobs, and justice for Brazil. Is this the beginning of his presidential campaign? And can you talk about particularly COVID and his attack on Bolsonaro around the pandemic, dealing with it?
I think the importance of Lula's restoration of his political rights is the fact that, I mean, if in 2022 he decides to run, he will be able to run. That is our job as his attorneys. I can speak as a Brazilian citizen's point of view that it is overwhelmingly difficult to be living here at this time when not wearing masks has been authorized, social gatherings has been authorized, actually even encouraged by the present administration, and where you cannot even go to the nearest hospital because of full occupation. And remaining in isolation for so long is taking a toll on everybody, of course. Now, believing in science, again, as a Brazilian, not as his attorney, believing in science, believing on vaccines, since yesterday has actually been positive. Everybody has been wearing masks, which is a major turn of events, and talking about vaccination campaigns seriously, which I can only thank democracy for. But what we have to understand is that there's a plan in all of this, which we have uncovered, which means that the car wash operation, and this has been confirmed through hard evidence in the files that we presented to the Supreme Court, that they had the car wash operation and certain members related to the car wash operation had a political plan to create teams of politicians, conservative politicians, that were approved by the car wash operation, and then removing everybody that was related to former President Lula's from their political lives, which came as a surprise and a shock to everybody, but which only confirmed what we had been saying since 2016, when we took this case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and we said that Lula, even before he was charged, that he was going to be convicted in spite of any probatory evidence that we could come up during the trial, because there weren't grounds for any charges at all, not even for the investigations. So there is no fear of a retrial, absolutely not, at this point, with all of the evidence produced during the trials, and with the evidences that that have been collected, that are still being collected by the defense, which prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that President Lula was a victim in a highly aggressive and complex procedure of lawfare, again, which is now being called not only by the defense, but even mentioned by authors, by academics, and as well as by one of the Supreme Court justices as the biggest judicial scandal on earth. The ramifications of this procedure will mainly reach Switzerland, United States, Brazil, all procedures contaminated and arising from the car wash operation, which was used as a political hub by the conservative politicians to overtake other governments. And I'm saying this not in a hypothetical point of view or hypothetical sentence. It is what is written by the prosecutors. The audios have been gathered. The conversations between the prosecutors, which also relate to the judges, speak of a scheme, confessed schemes, since planning how to put Supreme Court justices against the wall to make sure they only judge according to what they wanted and how they wanted, and how all of these plans have come to be executed. The attacks on the defense, even by tapping our main line from the law firm, tapping cellular phones, controlling my migratory movements. Yeah. That means that they planned to have all airline passenger lists to make sure that they knew where all the defense attorneys were and who they were talking to and what they were doing. So it is
Valeska, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Valeska. We only have a minute left, and I just want to say that, Lula is far ahead in a poll that was conducted earlier for next year's election. Is there any possibility that the retrial could prevent him from running, as some have expressed concerns might happen? We only have a minute.
From the evidences, the exculpatory evidence, from the evidences of innocence presented in the files, it is, if the law is fully applied, it is impossible that he will be convicted.
Valeska Martins, I want to thank you so much for being with us. One of President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva's lead attorneys, co-author of Lawfare, Waging War Through War, founder of Lawfare Institute. Thank you for joining us from Brazil. This is Democracy Now! As we move on next to the Biden administration struggling to find shelter space for a record 3,500 unaccompanied children recently detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. Stay with us.
Atenção, para as janelas no alto, atenção. Ao pisar o asfalto, mangue, atenção. Para o sangue sobre o chão, é preciso estar atento e forte. Não temos tempo de temer a morte. É preciso estar atento e forte. Não temos tempo de temer a morte. Atenção, tudo é perigoso. Tudo é divino, maravilhoso. Atenção para o refrão. É preciso estar atento e forte. Não temos tempo de temer a morte. É preciso estar atento e forte. Não temos tempo de temer a morte. É preciso estar atento e forte. Não temos tempo de temer a morte. É preciso estar atento e forte.
Gal Costa here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. President Biden struggling to address the overwhelming flow of migrant children crossing the U.S.-Mexico border without their parents, many fleeing extreme violence, poverty, natural disasters in their home countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Documents obtained by several news outlets show more than 3,500 children were detained at the border in just the first 9 days of March. On Monday, CBS News reported some 3,000 children are still detained in crowded cells at Border Patrol stations. Many are being held longer than the legal limit of 72 hours as the government waits for beds to become available in shelters run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, and Department of Health and Human Services. The Washington Post reports the shelters received more than 450 new migrant children per day on average in the first week of March. Most are between the ages of 13 and 17. The Centers for the Disease Control and Prevention cited the, quote, extraordinary circumstances Friday when it said the shelters can return to pre-pandemic capacity if they implement enhanced coronavirus protections. Biden's top advisor on U.S.-Mexico border policy, Roberta Jacobson, said Wednesday the administration's trying to balance a humane response to the children with the message that they should stop crossing.
I think all of us at every stage of this process are doing everything we can to make sure that children are well cared for and moved into facilities that are appropriate for them. But I want to make a point again that it's really important that people not make the dangerous journey in the first place.
During Jacobson's press briefing, she broke into Spanish several times to say the borders closed and announced the revival of an Obama-era policy that allows Central American children to apply for admission to the United States from their home country. This comes as the Biden administration recently reopened a shelter in Carrizo Springs, Texas, that was used by the Trump administration and plans to hold some 700 migrant teenagers there. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki defended the move.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities. It is not a replication, certainly not. That is never our intention of replicating the immigration policies of the past administration.
As the Biden administration looks for more space to house the record influx of migrant children, it may move to house them on military bases or even a vacant NASA research center in the San Francisco Bay Area. For more, we go to Aura Bogado, the senior investigative reporter at Reveal, who's long covered immigration and the conditions of detained migrant children. Last year in a series titled The Disappeared, she exposed how the U.S. was holding migrant children far longer than previously known. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Aura, it's great to have you with us. Can you start off by saying, would you call this a surge? Would you call it a crisis? And what needs to be done?
There is an increase of young, mostly Central American migrants at the southern border. We can use different words. We can call it a crisis. We can call it a surge, which is a term that's usually more associated with the natural water phenomena. What we shouldn't call it is a surprise. The Biden administration long knew that there would be an increase of children at the southern border and had a long time to prepare. While he's only been in office less than 2 months, he'd been elected prior to that, and he campaigned on specifically changing policies and practices that happened under the Trump administration. Some of that has indeed happened, but when it comes to the number of children that are in certain facilities, whether they're cages or shelters, and how long they're being kept for, we haven't really seen that much of a change.
And Aura, explain what you think needs to happen. What should the Biden administration be doing now so that there aren't so many children in detention?
Well, as a reporter, I would like for the Biden administration to be transparent, something, again, that I think the Biden administration, when he was a campaign, was both implicit and tacit about in his promises. I was on a call with several reporters yesterday with the current commissioner of the CBP, Troy Miller, and he would not tell us the number of children that are in these cells at the border. They're usually called hieleras. They're really cold cells. That's how kids and adults describe them. And he wouldn't tell us the number. He said that he couldn't share because it was law enforcement sensitive. He was pressed on this, and he told us that it was that multiple agencies were involved. Again, that doesn't explain why he couldn't tell us the number of children that were there. As you mentioned, several reporters have gotten their hands on internal numbers, and so it seems to be about 3,200 children are in these cells. I can't imagine the reason why this would be law enforcement sensitive. And I, as a reporter, can think of the reasons why people want to know. So I think, at a very basic level, we should at least know the numbers of children that are being kept in different facilities, both at the border and also in shelters. That would be a great start. I would love to see the Biden administration just give us, some really, really basic transparency.
And Aura, can you explain how the pandemic has been impacting the ways in which unaccompanied minor children are being held? Is it taking longer to release them as a result of the pandemic? And explain what Title 42 is, and how the Trump administration made the CDC invoke this title.
Yeah, so Title 42 is a public health title that it's a practice that keeps the public health. It centers the public health of the current U.S. population. And so the idea is that you don't want people coming from the outside that might bring something like COVID into the United States. As it is, we know that COVID is already in the United States. And so that was under the prior administration that the CDC felt the need to, close the border for that reason. That's still in place. That's not to say that no one has entered the border, even during when Trump was still in office, but certainly now that Biden is in office. But people are still being barred from entering on the premise that there is a public health concern, and there absolutely is. There absolutely is a public health concern. People are still unfortunately dying from what is now a preventable disease because we do have a vaccine. And so people are still being barred. And yes, sometimes things do take longer. You do want to make sure that that no one is in the type of situation in which they may possibly be spreading the disease. But again, there are ways to prevent this. There are ways to, I think in the last year, we've had a lot of time to figure out how to socially distance. And that may be something that is taking longer in order to process children through. But it doesn't really go to the heart of the question, which I think for a lot of people, there is concern of the sheer number of children that are being kept at the border in these Border Patrol facilities and also in shelters.
And the effect of this, I'm going to go back a number of years when you were a reporter Color Lines in 2014. This is under Obama. You spoke with a migrant girl from Honduras named Mayeli Hernandez, who described what it was like to be held in a hilera when she was 11 years old.
It was really cold there, and they had us inside. We were there for a long time. We didn't sleep. We didn't sleep, and our eyes were really red. We didn't shower. We didn't brush our teeth. We hardly did anything. They don't give you a bed to sleep in there. It's really cold. You shiver from the cold. There was only one bathroom, one room. And these big blocks of pure cement. That's where we would sit and lay down. There are no windows, and you can't tell if it's day or night. You can't see anything. You're just stuck in a room with lights.
We're talking about a hilera, what's known as an ice box. That's 2014. Are they experiencing the same thing today? If you could just briefly address that before we end.
Yes, that is what children are still describing because they're still in the same facilities that were being used under Obama, continued under Trump, and continue under Biden.
Finally, I wanted to just ask you, in the minute we have left, congratulations on getting a vaccine. Can you talk about your journey and getting better? It's so great to see you so well, Aura.
Oh, that's such a great question. Yes, I'm a cancer survivor, almost 2 years out. And I was able to get a leftover dose a couple of days ago. My arm was a little sore yesterday, but I think I'm pretty much back to normal today. And I'm very, very grateful that I was able to get that vaccine and can't wait until I can see you in person and then, also all my loved ones. It's been a very long year.
Auda, thanks so much for being with us. I look forward to so much more great reporting from you. Auda Bogado, senior investigative reporter, reveals long-covered immigration, including the conditions of detained migrant children. Next up, we look at the global fight over COVID vaccine patents. The U.S. and other wealthy nations are once again backing the big drug companies, while the World Health Organization says patent rights should be waived. Stay with us.
Caminando y no sabes qué hacer. Vas caminando y no puedes ni ver. Y te ocultas del tiempo, llegas al mar. Llegas muy lejos, vuelves a empezar. Y preguntas. ¿Por qué quieres volver? A la arena caliente, a los pasos ligeros, a las fotos del baúl, a los ojos sinceros, al cálido viento.
Yana Guimeros here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. The United States and other wealthy members of the World Trade Organization have blocked a proposal to waive intellectual property rights related to COVID vaccines. South Africa and India had pushed the proposal as part of an attempt to increase the availability of vaccines in poorer countries. The People's Vaccine Alliance recently said while rich countries are vaccinating one person every second, the majority of poorer nations have yet to administer a single shot. That's over 100 nations. Some nations, including many in Africa, may have to wait years before getting enough vaccines to protect their populations. World Health Organization has also joined the call for Big Pharma to waive vaccine patent rights.
Many countries with vaccine manufacturing capacity can start producing their own vaccines by waiving intellectual property rights, as provided for in the TRIPS agreement. Those provisions are there for use in emergencies. If now is not a time to use them, then when? This is unprecedented times, and we believe, and WHO believes, that this is a time to trigger that provision and waive patent rights.
On Wednesday, Senator Bernie Sanders addressed an online rally organized by a coalition known as the People's Vaccine ahead of this global day of action that's happening today.
I believe that a very good way to demonstrate that American values are back is for the United States to play a leading role in facilitating the production and delivery of these life-saving vaccines and in sharing the innovative technologies for producing them. And that is why today I am sending a letter to the Biden administration to support a proposal to waive vaccine-related intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization so that we can rapidly expand supplies of vaccines.
Earlier today, as part of the Global Day of Action, South African protesters rallied outside a Johnson & Johnson facility in Cape Town and Pfizer's headquarters in Johannesburg. We're joined now by two guests from India and South Africa. Fatima Hassan is South African human rights lawyer, HIV, AIDS, and social justice activist, founder and director of Health Justice Initiative. She served as special advisor to South Africa's former Minister of Health. Her recent piece in Foreign Policy, Don't Let Drug Companies Create a System of Vaccine Apartheid. And joining us from Bangalore, India, is Achal Prabhala, coordinator of Access IBSA, the project, which campaigns for access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa, recently co-authored a piece in the New York Times headlined, "It's Time to Trust China's and Russia's Vaccines." We're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to go to Fatima Hassan. Thanks so much for being with us, because you just finished a major news conference and address in South Africa. Talk about what you said and what this day of action is about. What has the U.S. done?
Thank you, Amy, and good to be on the show. So it's 1 year since the WHO declared that COVID-19 would be a pandemic. And in order to mark that 1 year declaration, organizations from around the world, including the People's Vaccine Campaign in South Africa, which has a number of organizations and individuals supporting it, have basically decided to take our demands to the pharmaceutical companies that at the moment are practicing what we call a pernicious form of vaccine apartheid, by refusing to give up their intellectual property rights and refusing to urgently scale up manufacturing capabilities and capacity for the global south, meaning that, millions of us are basically going to have to wait for a vaccine, putting global immunity as well as regional immunity, particularly in Africa, at severe risk.
And Achal, if you could explain, when we discuss problems of vaccine access around the world, we're speaking principally about Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. But you wrote a piece in the New York Times, as we mentioned earlier, headlined, "It's Time to Trust China's and Russia's Vaccines." Could you talk about what you believe the significance is, the importance is of those vaccines for the Global South, and what you think needs to be done?
Thank you, Nermi. It's a situation that we've seen of the utter failure of the Western pharmaceutical industry to address the needs of 85% of the world. That's become very clear now. But we've also seen a failure of Western philanthropy. So the COVAX facility, which is run by Gavi, recently sent out a shipment to cover 300,000 people in Ghana, or less than 1% of the population of Ghana. And this is while countries like the United Arab Emirates and Israel have vaccinated between 50 and 60% of their populations. The United States and the UK have between 20 and 35% of their populations vaccinated. So the idea that philanthropy from the West would save us is turning out to be a false hope. In this context, one of the reasons it's so hard to negotiate with Western pharmaceutical manufacturers is that we seemingly have no alternative. We don't have generic drugs from India for AIDS that we could use as an alternative in 2000. The problem is we do have an alternative. We just have to acknowledge that it exists. And the alternative at the moment are vaccines from China and Russia. There are two leading vaccine candidates in China and one in Russia, which have struck supply deals of close to 3 billion doses just for this year. They are the lifeline to middle-income countries all over Latin America, the Arab world, South Asia, and Pakistan and India, where I live, Malaysia and Indonesia. But the problem with them is that we seem to be in a state of denial that they exist, even though they have such rich utility, both in terms of solving an immediate problem in the pandemic, but also serving as a really useful cudgel to negotiate with Western pharmaceutical companies to gain more access to their vaccines.
And Achal, but explain, why do you think it is that there's such skepticism about the Russia and China vaccines? I mean, there are reports that people within Russia are refusing to take Sputnik V. And also the response to your piece, your New York Times piece, from China and Russia, as well as from here in the U.S.
I have to say that at the start, it should be just said, I think that the entire world, not just the West, is incredulous at the idea that you can have useful science in this pandemic come out of places not in the West. But this is just a fact. And it's not just a fact in the West, it's a fact in India, it's a fact in Southern Africa, it's a fact in Russia and China, as you mentioned. There have been many reports about this. One of the problems with this is that to overcome these perceptions, we need to have a better access to data and a better grasp of the facts on the ground. The fact that incredibly rigorous regulatory authorities in Turkey and Brazil and Indonesia have approved these vaccines and run trials on them somehow doesn't seem to matter or break through into the dialogue about global vaccine access. And this includes activists, unfortunately. We've had several conversations. I love the People's Vaccine Campaign. I stand for everything that it does, and I was one of the first signatories to its letter last year, which kicked off the campaign. But I should say that many activists are also blind to this, and I think prey to the same kind of denial that there are vaccines outside the West that can work. And it's not just Russia and China, by the way. So India has a vaccine which just posted interim efficacy results of 81%. We're already exporting it to Brazil and to other countries. There are vaccines under development in Cuba, in Thailand, in a range of different countries. And if we created a better enabling infrastructure to validate these vaccines or even just assess them, then that would go a long way in increasing the confidence in science that comes out of the West and good science that comes out of bad states.
Can you respond to that, Fatima Hassan?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I think Achal is right. Even the COVAX mechanism doesn't as yet have any agreements with Sinopharm or Sinovac as well as Sputnik. In South Africa, the situation is slightly different. We don't have a single vaccine registered for widespread population use as yet because all of the dossiers are still being reviewed. In the case of Sputnik, they finally only in the last few weeks submitted their dossier, and that's currently under review. What we've been told is that Sinopharm and Sinovac have not submitted their dossiers and are not willing to share their data. So particularly in the South African context with a very stringent regulator, whether it's Sinopharm, whether it's Sputnik, whether it's Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca or NIH, Moderna, all of them have to submit their data, and they're subject to the same review. And so I think that even though there may be vaccines from Russia and China, the issues that we have as activists around the transparency of all of these companies, around all of their data, around all of the dossiers, still stands. The second issue, obviously, is that we also need pricing transparency across all of these different companies, because we are getting reports that in different countries we started rolling out some of the Sputnik or Sinopharm or Sinovac or AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson, whichever vaccine it may be, based on the authorization that they've received, that there's very little pricing transparency. So the concern, as you know, is that also there's differential pricing structures within COVAX, but then also within the bilaterals. So I think it's true to say that there is an overlooking of some of the vaccines that actually come from countries that don't normally, Western countries don't normally want to deal with them or don't normally want to buy their vaccines. But the issues that we have around transparency, around data sharing, around regulatory and review and approval, I think applies to all of them. In relation to the Chinese vaccines, and I'm just using that to basically cover both Sinopharm and Sinovac, what our government has said on oath is that until the data is actually submitted, they're just basically having preliminary conversations. And in South Africa, that seems to have been brokered through the Chinese embassy. I think, because India and South Africa are also part of BRICS, the irony in relation to how we are relying on Western vaccines or whether we're relying on the Russian or Chinese vaccines is that Brazil is the outlier at the moment. It's opposing the TRIPS waiver that South Africa and India have been leading in Geneva since last year. And so there's a number of geopolitical considerations that are beyond just the efficacy of vaccines that are actually playing out and are going to influence the final vaccine selections for a number of countries in Africa.
I wanted to turn to the head of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, lobbying group for Big Pharma. This is Thomas Quinney.
Everybody who knows about vaccine manufacturing and was addressing the bottlenecks knew that IP is not the issue. The bottlenecks are the capacity, the scarcity of raw materials, scarcity of ingredients, and it is about the know-how.
So, Fatima Hassan, can you respond to Big Pharma?
Yeah, so Big Pharma said this at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and, Achal correctly pointed out in the beginning, we were able to ramp up the activism, really challenge a lot of these myths and a lot of these claims from Big Pharma. I mean, we were even sued by the pharmaceutical industry in South Africa, but I think that where there is a political will, where there is an explicit cooperation to share the vaccine know-how and technology, there certainly is capacity in the Global South to do two things. One, fill and finish, but two, even to do full manufacturing. And this is, when you ask the first question around what the U.S. government could do or what it hasn't done, a number of activists in the U.S. and around the world have said to the Biden administration, if you step in on some of the vaccines that you've actually co-funded and co-developed through the NIH, you could, with a little bit of investment and over the next few months, actually invest in massive scaling up and expanding production. So I think it's quite disingenuous for Big Pharma. I mean, it's not unexpected, but it is disingenuous for them to say that intellectual property is actually not the block and is not the obstacle. Right now, that is the current, largest obstacle. If the patents were to be relaxed, if the intellectual property protections were to be relaxed, and they were to either be done on a voluntary basis or through a compulsory mechanism, then certainly we believe that we would be in a different situation in the next few months. I think the shameful thing and the moral, question is, had this actually been sorted out and addressed in 2020, I do think that many people in the Global South would have been facing a very different outlook, and we would have been in a very different situation.
And Achal, can you talk about the bilateral agreements that many countries in the Global South have reached with Russia and China, and also the development of original vaccines in many countries, including India and Cuba and others, and where those stand?
To follow up from what Fatima was saying, intellectual property is a broad term. It covers patents, it also covers know-how and the actual technology that you use to produce that vaccine. And the pharmaceutical industry is always sort of half right in saying that, yes, you don't just need our patents in order to be able to produce this. You also need our technology. But they're, of course, being completely disingenuous in phrasing it that way. One of the significant things that the Chinese and Russian manufacturers have done is to share their licensing and their know-how and their technology. They've done this with Brazil, so they're manufacturing there. Sinovac is manufacturing in Brazil, Turkey, and Indonesia. Sinopharm has set up a huge unit in the United Arab Emirates that is not only going to supply the region and the country, but also all its allies in the Arab world. The Russian vaccine, Sputnik V, has production agreements with at least 5 different pharmaceutical companies in India to supply something like 500 million doses this year, as well as agreements with South Korea and agreements with a large number of other places. So one of the distinguishing features about them, they're not angels, these are companies and they're in it at least not to lose money. But one of the distinguishing features about them is that they seem to be much more flexible to enter into agreements. If they can supply from China or Russia, they will. If they can't, and the vaccine can be made in the countries they're striking deals with, they allow that to happen. And that's actually an incredibly positive step that we could take advantage of. The problem is that the WHO functions on a weird mid-20th century axis where it considers any regulatory system outside of Europe, Canada, and the United States to be suspect automatically. So the process of certifying these vaccines to apply billions and dollars of donor funds to buy them is incredibly complex, and they've been waiting in line for months, despite Western vaccines just sort of breezing through the queue at the WHO. This is a really unfair structural problem that needs to be fixed. The African Union ordered 300 million doses of the Sputnik vaccine. That's actually going to cover 20% of the most vulnerable people in all low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's an incredible step towards gaining access to the vaccine and exiting the pandemic for the poorest countries on Earth. But now, the organizations like the WHO, the COVAX facility, and Gavi have to recognize that these vaccines exist, that there are more vaccines coming out, and help them to get out into the world rather than hinder them.
We want to thank you both for being with us. Absolutely key points that you are raising on this day of action. Achal Pravala is the Access IPSA project in Bangalore, India, of that group, and Fatima Hassan is founder of Health Justice Initiative in Cape Town, South Africa. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnock, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tay Marie Astor, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.